Okay, my name is Myunggu Kang. It is my great honor to be as a moderator at today's session, and I really thank you for the preparing. Thank you for the thank you Dr. Che to preparing this session and Mr. Shila's keynote presentation. Okay, so today we will talk about the World Urban Forum. The topic you already know.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Junyoung, for organizing this very important webinar, which is very timely for different reasons. One reason is the fact that Africa is rapidly urbanizing, as you mentioned it, and there's something that needs to be done to use, wisely this urbanization as a driver for transformation of the continent and not as a challenge. Secondly, as well, we have seen a lot of movement in the continent. Now we can say this topic of urbanization is speaking at the continental level, and that's the reason why we have this Africa Urban Forum in April here in Nairobi to reflect on the status of urbanization continent, where we are, and what are the challenges and what are different approaches that the continent should be taking to address this urbanization. And of course, the World Urban Forum 2 weeks ago in Baku, but most importantly as well, we would like to acknowledge and recognize the good partnership we have with the government of Korea. Myself, I had 3 missions in Korea from my previous engagement with the Global Land 2 Networks on the issue of land governance. And I understand Korea as well is supporting Uenhabitat and national urban policy in many countries. So we believe that this engagement we are having today will be an opportunity as well to explore further and deepen this collaboration between Africa and the government of Korea. Of course, let's start. The purpose of my presentation is to give you an update where we are in the process of urbanization in Africa. Secondly, what are those responses already existing at the continental and global level? And lastly, how Uenhabitat is approaching this urbanization in Africa. What are different tools? What are different streams that Uenhabitat has put in place to support member states in Africa to accompany this trend of urbanization? Is very important because Uenhabitat is the leading agencies when it comes to the issue of urbanization and housing in the continent. So as I mentioned it here, the trend of urbanization is well known, Professor. When you talk about the power of urbanization, it's about the speed we are facing in Africa when it comes to urbanization. Today, we are talking about 700 million people living in cities in Africa. And by 2030, Africa will reach what we call the urban transition, with more people living in cities than others. And according to the statistic of Uenhabitat, by 2050, the continent will reach 1.3 billion living in cities, more people living in cities than rural area. And one element which is very important, the prevalence of youth, because when you talk about this urban growth, 70% are composed of youth, looking for better life, looking for access to digital system, looking for access to basic services. Of course, the issue we raise, the issue of informality. When this urbanization is not well accompanied, well planned, well managed, we ended up with informality. Unfortunately, the continent is struggling with the issue of informality, like Kenya, where I am, where you have more than 50% of the population living in informal settlement. And we talk about informal settlement is the failure of planning, is the issue of access to basic services and access to tenant security. One element which is very important as well, the deficit on access to housing. Of course, the production of housing is not following the increase of population in the continent. That's why today we have a housing gap. People are talking about 50 million housing gap, depending on the country you're talking about. But at the same time, we see this gap increasing because of the increase of population. Of course, Africa's cities are facing the issue of the brunt of climate change. Infrastructure damage due to flooding and drought. And today the cost and the gap of infrastructure in Africa, according to the African Development Bank, is 150 billion a year to be able to cover the whole need for the continent. And on that, we need to look at the resilient aspect of the infrastructure. That's why we believe that thinking about green infrastructure is very important for the continent. But of course, we shouldn't ignore the opportunity coming along with this urbanization, because cities can be center for innovation, industrialization, job creation, but also beckon for economic growth and transformation, especially for youth. That the reflection, that is the scenario that Uninhabitat is taking. The whole question we are asking ourselves is how to unlock the potential of urbanization to make sure a city become a driver for economic transformation, engine for economic transformation in Africa. Of course, we need to look at different elements from the governance aspect, the planning aspect, and the resilience aspect of it. And I think that something we learned from this engagement of the Africa Urban Forum and for the World Urban Forum, Africa is looking for best practices, best experience to overcome those challenges they are facing, so that industrialization can work very well, in Africa, but also how to harness the digital era we are working with to allow job creation for youth and others. This is an introduction. Of course, as I mentioned, this aspect of urbanization and housing is getting now continental momentum, and that's the reason why Uninhabitat is closely working with the African Union as a technical advisor role. Of course, we work on establishing the concept of Africa Urban Forum, which is a platform gathering every 2 years to look at the issue of urbanization and housing. We are supporting special technical committees within the African Union. We are working and monitoring together the implementation of the new urban agenda in Africa. That's the reason why Uninhabitat has developed with African Union the framework for the implementation of the new urban agenda in Africa. But also there are some ongoing collaboration specific projects like urban resilience in Africa to support 30 cities in Africa to be resilient against climate change, but also to leverage green investment. We start now a new collaboration with AUF2, the new partner for Africa, because they established the development fund. And now Uninhabitat is helping developing what we call the urban strategy to link with infrastructure in Africa to see how we can address, for example, the issue of urban settlement or human settlement along the infrastructure development corridor, for example, in Africa. So yes, the second Africa Urban Forum, which is a big milestone, as you may recall it, the first Africa Urban Forum happened in Ethiopia in 2024. There was the inaugural Africa Urban Forum. The question we have been trying to answer during this first Africa Urban Forum was how urbanization can be a driver for economic development in Africa in line with the Vision 2063, because Africa Union has established a flagship program, which is the Vision 2063. And urbanization had a key role to play on developing, different stream of jobs, but also on creating value addition in the GDP of each country. The second Africa Urban Forum was held in Kenya, and the topic was, of course, around adequate housing and how housing can be as well a lever for economic development, because we know that in Africa there's a lot need to be done to make sure housing respond to the need for job transformation, for industrialization, but also, as you mentioned, Professor, housing is not stand alone. It has to be connected to the whole ecosystem, urban planning, urban governance, environmental issues, all these financial issues, all these things are related to, should be connected to housing. That's why in Uninhabitat, we talk about housing at the center. It's not only the four roof, it's more than that. It's an ecosystem. So it was a very successful Africa Urban Forum. Of course, more than 12,000 participants, more than 34 African ministers, country represented all over the world, but also the president of Kenya was here during the forum to share the experience of Kenya on affordable housing production. This was a joint initiative, of course, of the African Union and the government of Kenya, happening every 2 years, supported by Uninhabitat and UNECA. So what was the topic of the forum? As I mentioned, I think it was more about demonstrating how adequate housing can advance socioeconomic and environmental transformation towards the realization of Agenda 2063. And to allow to respond to this question, there was 6 thematic areas has been discussed. One was about urban planning and infrastructure development. Second one, resilience building and sustainable urban development, take into consideration the challenge that cities in Africa are facing when it comes to climate change. The third one is about smart city, technology innovation connected to the urban growth in Africa, because there's a lot of demand now on smart city and digitalization for cities and local government. The fourth one, of course, which is the elephant in the room, was about innovative financing for housing urban development, to look at really in the context of a financial crisis, what could be the avenue that can be used to support, financing of housing in Africa. Of course, private sectors has been highlight of key element, but also we have seen a lot of stream in Africa on unlocking domestic resources. And the fifth thematic area was transformation, reform, and settlement, which is one of the hot topics. And lastly, urban displacement of migration in the continent, take into consideration many conflicts happening in Africa now, whether it is in Central Africa or in Sudan and other in the Sahel region, but also this displacement has been triggered by climate change in many occasions as well, pulling people to come to the cities. What was the outcome of the Africa Urban Forum? The overall purpose of this Africa Urban Forum, as I mentioned earlier, more about sustaining and elevating the political commitment of member states. Of course, we are still working on it, and we realize that some countries are much advanced than others, and there's need to have a political leverage to make sure urbanization and housing are anchored in national development planning. That's why one element was a political commitment and the needed reform of urbanization and housing to make sure, government are taking the appropriate step to address this one. That's why housing policy was one element, empowering institution for innovation and also integrated urbanization into inclusive sustainable economic development framework, including national development plan. The second outcome was on land infrastructure supply, policy and strategy, because we know that land has a lot of issues in Africa when it comes to tenure security, when it comes to land information system, when it comes to governance, and these are impeding a lot of infrastructure development in the continent, including even housing system, because the cost of housing in many countries is high because land price is very high and there's not much control on the land system because of the lack of land information system. That's why African member states agreed to advance land reform, to upgrade informal settlement, but also to integrate in the process infrastructure development, but also support industrialization of housing value chain, which is very important. The third one is fiscal reform and access to finance, as we discussed it. Today, I think the whole reflection is how to unlock the domestic revenue system, while ODA is going down and dwindling. So it's good to look at public-private sector, but also look into climate finance, the green finance system, how can connect to the housing delivery. And I think there's a lot of conversation going on now. The role of microfinance is very important as well, because communities can put together their saving and find a way of facing the challenge of housing with the support of government. This will require, of course, strong policies and strong subsidy system from the central government, and cannot be done alone by private sectors and cannot be done alone by public government. They need to work together to come up with a blending financing system, for example, is one of the avenues we want to explore. Yes, these are three additional outcomes from this Africa Urban Forum. Of course, national urban policy is important, but in the context of Africa, where we have seen a very rapid transition from rural to urban, it's good to have a territorial approach to the urban development that connect rural and urban. That's why national urban policy and territorial plan are key, and connecting this in terms of value chain, in terms of market, in terms of production is very important. And this will create as well an opportunity to see what are those needs for financing when you come urban infrastructure, especially when you connect to rural area. Of course, investment ready project, that's something Uenhabitat is supporting, but most important is a corridor approach that many donors are taking in Africa, how we can connect national urban policy, human settlement to the corridor development. And I have some example on that. I will come back to that. Urban climate action and natural risk, disaster risk reduction has become priority now for cities and municipalities, and Uenhabitat is supporting in terms of identifying bankable project, mobilization of stakeholders, resilience program, and promote low carbon climate smart urban development. And lastly, inclusive community, where we have informal economy in Africa. Is very important to look at the role of economy, and that's the reason why we connect this community to informal settlement upgrading, but also to reducing poverty in the urban area through participatory urban development approach. Those are some resolutions taken by member states during the Africa Urban Forum. So the one purpose as well of the Africa Urban Forum was to prepare Africa to better contribute to the World Urban Forum as well, because I think the thematic area was a bit similar, because Africa Urban Forum was about housing in Africa, but the thematic for World Urban Forum was safe and resilient cities and community and housing the world, which was well attended by African delegation, and also globally speaking, I think this is the most attended World Urban Forum that Uninhabited has ever organized, with 57 participants, 176 countries, 11 head of state, and 88 ministers, with a number of African ministers. But what was interesting with this World Urban Forum is the Africa Urban Forum Declaration was captured by the call to action by the World Urban Forum, which means that there are close connection between Africa and the rest of the world now when it comes to the issue of housing. So here, just to share some highlight of this World Urban Forum and the transition from Africa Urban Forum to the World Urban Forum. Of course, there was more than 20 African ministers. First of all, African ministers agree now on the declaration action plan, how to implement the action plan from Nairobi, Africa Urban Forum, and there's a known action plan being already finalized. And this action plan will be a table in the Executive Committee of the African Union. Secondly, as we launched the Africa Affordable Housing Compact during the Africa Urban Forum, there was an opportunity as well to reconvene ministers to see how they can work together on filling the gap when it comes to affordability of housing. And Uninhabited has established this housing compact being endorsed by member states as a vehicle for supporting financing, technical advisory role to member states. And lastly, Uninhabited has launched as well a flagship program, a flagship report, which is the African Cities Report, which was more about on land-based financing this time, which was more a way of showing that land can be an instrument for financing infrastructure and others' need and service delivery in Africa, how to go about. There's a lot of experience, and I think Korea is very advanced on that, on land-based financing, on financing infrastructure, and that's something as well Uninhabited is promoting the continent to fill the financing gap, but also to make sure housing is contributed, properly to the need for basic services and infrastructure development. So from there now, I can show you some initiative, how Uninhabited gonna implement those recommendations, the call to action from Baku and the Africa Urban Forum. This will give you an overview of the presence of Uninhabited in Africa. Today, Uninhabited is supporting 32 countries in Africa on various streams of work related to urbanization, and our establishment in Africa is progressing in a sense that there's more and more demand on the issue of technical advisory role for many African countries. And even this week, next week, I'm going to Namibia to discuss with the government the establishment of Uninhabited in Namibia. I think this is showing as well the interest of member states and the seriousness of member states on the issue of urbanization and housing in Africa. So yes, I talk about the Africa Affordable Housing Compact is a purpose vehicle adopted by member states with Uninhabited, with the goal of designing the continent's significant housing shortfall with innovative, scalable, and bankable solutions. Is very important. And its core objective is to align effort toward the development of affordable housing that is not only accessible, but also sustainable and resilient. So the Affordable Housing Compact aims to catalyze investment, of course, by demonstrating the emerging business opportunity with housing market, positioning housing development as an attractive investment for investor and financial institution. And this compact is articulated around 4 pillars. One pillar is a country compact, because member states have to adhere to the housing compact delivery unit, and the delivery unit has been established as Uninhabited Secretariat. We have as well a digital matchmaking capital, which is the deal platform where we identify bankable projects and help private sectors meet with central government and local government and develop the projects they need to unlock investment. We have as well a component on executive fellowship, which is more about leadership and capacity building for many actors in the housing sectors. I think it's very important in terms of capacity development, especially for Africa. And also we have the housing data hub, because we know there's a gap and challenges on data in Africa when it comes to housing and land. So how we can have a repository of all information related to land and to housing, from rental housing to ownership and different ingredients interacting with the housing ecosystem. That's the reason why UN Habitat. So this housing compact is in the make, and we call upon private sector, we call upon university, we call upon different central government to join this compact as a leverage for respond to the demand of member state in a very collective manners, but also creating this synergy and complementarity between different actors, from private sector to public sector, and from academia, to see how we can support member state on filling the housing gap. Another initiative, of course, UN Habitat has an initiative on smart cities, as you may know it. We are working with UNITAC, United Nations Accelerators for Technology Accelerator for Cities, which is based in Hamburg and funded by Germany. We are supporting many countries on developing their smart city strategy, including Cameroon, some element in Niger, and also we support Rwanda, and we are working on developing different tools for example, for mapping informal settlement. And this is one example of AI utilization on mapping, informal settlement using automated mappers and using machine learning and satellite imagery. And this has been implemented in South Africa, in Pretoria, and also in Equitini, Durban. I think this is something which is growing on giving real information and real data on the situation of informal settlement. As mentioned, this is another tool, as I mentioned, which has been developed with Human Settlement Unit in South Africa, using automated building footprint mapping, applying area with 25% informal settlement population, and this being extended as well in Central America and also in other areas. So another area of work of UN Habitat is a corridor aspect of it, and we have good collaboration with the African Union on that and with European Union to see how we connect this corridor with human settlement and also connect with urban development, knowing the corridor will attract people, and you will have cities emerging along the corridor development, especially secondary cities, and those secondary cities can become a hub of economic development and related and connected to the function of the corridor, whether it is economic, trade, or logistic corridor. And that's a reflection we are doing. And one element, of course, is the approach to urbanization and planning. We need territorial planning, as I mentioned it, but also we need how support local government along those corridors in terms of governance strengthening, but also in terms of collection of local revenue, for example. And this is something, right now we are working with AU NEPAD on the same issues to develop the knowledge, but also to do concrete analysis on how we can enter along those corridors to support, urban development through planning, governance structure, but also through revenue generation. This is the model of corridor we have now between Kenya and Uganda on the Busia Metropole. Those who know very well Uganda, and this is the closest border between Uganda and Kenya, and the work of UN Habitat consists in developing integrated city region spatial economic framework, mapping clarification on land tenure system, establishing land information system, of course, capacity development for decision makers, and establishing data for evidence-based decision. And this will foster movement of goods and people along the two borders, but also increase the volume of operation and transaction along the corridor for the benefit of the population in the two countries. Another area, of course, we are working, strategy planning West Africa, where we are working in the Sahel region in many countries on territorial planning to allow us to understand the challenge of economic development, but also this territorial planning will help us to identify the hubs and also the economic, lands, economic, centers where donors can invest. And this has been implemented, as I mentioned it, by using the special development strategy, that tool that UN Habitat has developed, working with communities, identify priority area, and looking into resilience building as well for those communities. And yes, urban regeneration as well. We are working with youth on access to housing. This is our experience in Baidoa in Somalia, where we are working with youth and developing skills, building houses and infrastructure, and look into resilience building as well. And this is the case of our work in Mozambique, which is prone to disaster as well, where UN Habitat is rehabilitating schools, housing, and hospital in Mozambique to make them resilient to shocks and stress when there's a flooding and other. And this is a strategy which is working very well in those particular country. So this is just some area, I mean, we highlight could be of interest in terms of collaboration. Of course, it's a menu, very long menu, but just to let you know that UN Habitat is embracing number of these elements. I mean, affordable housing is a key priority today for UN Habitat with our strategic plan. Another point is own source revenue generation, looking into land and other sources of revenue. Of course, regional planning, which is quite fundamental. Waste management, of course, that's something UN Habitat is working with Japan and other stakeholders on developing strategy. And right now we are working with World Bank on developing a high-scale project on waste management to bring in investment on this particular sector. Smart cities and strategy, of course. And I can see our work as well on crisis, displacement, Somalia, Sahel regions, DRC, where UN Habitat is working on displacement prevention. We have as well our work on climate change and cities, mainly looking into resilience building. And of course, lastly, smart city and digital transformation that we streamline in many of our work right now, even on the planning process. We are using digital tools now for mapping, but also for developing repository on those planning process. This is more or less, Professor, an overview on the work of UN Habitat, but also that give you a sense and a view on what's going on in the continent when it comes to urbanization and housing. So again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I'll be happy to respond to any question you may have after the presentation of other speakers.
My presentation is about some implication from the urban event. My question is what implication and Korea or the East Asian community can and do for the African planning. So this year, we see the two events, Global Urban Conversation in Africa. About Africa, the first one is the Second African Urban Forum in Nairobi, framed housing as a lever for socio-economic and environmental transformation toward the African Agenda 2063. And a few weeks later, it is the global, but also dealing with the African urban issues. 13th World Urban Forum WUF13 in Baku framed housing as the basis of safe, resilient, and inclusive communities. The shared message is striking in its simplicity. Housing is no longer only about construction, it is about urban planning, land, finance, climate, services, and governance, all at once. For the Korean planning community, this is the key point. We should read these forums not as housing or housing supply story, but as a planning agenda. If you place the two agendas side by side, you can see how they fit together. African Urban Forum 2 localizes the agenda for Africa, adequate housing for all, informality and basic services, local government capacity, urban finance, and Africa-led evidence. WUF13 globalizes it. The global housing crisis, safe and resilient communities, climate and conflict pressures, and inclusive people-centered urbanization. In other words, Nairobi made it specific to Africa, Baku made it a shared global implementation challenge, and that shared challenge is exactly where a planning community like ours can find common ground. So what is our Korean academia or planner and government role? I would suggest 4 modest but concrete roles for Korean planning scholars communities. First, context reader to study local planning systems, land informality and governance before proposing solutions. Second, knowledge broker to connect planners, universities, local governments, and development agencies. Third, comparative researcher to compare Korea's experience with the African urban realities without assuming it can be transferred directly. And fourth, program designer to translate what we learn into small, fundable cooperation modules. None of these require grand declaration. They require curiosity, rigor, and patients. So, which brings me to the real purpose of today. The priority is not support from any single actor. The priority is the joint discovery of new cooperation agendas. And that happens only when each sphere re-examines African urban issues from its own role. Government can recast African urban issues within cooperation and ODA policy, moving beyond the symbolic commitments towards practical fundable themes. Korean academia can reread African urbanization. It's very not familiar context, but we can read African urbanization as a planning agenda, context, land informality, and governance. And research institutions like our institutions can build the evidence, comparative studies, data, and pilots that turns shared interest into concrete programs. Where these views meet is where meaningful cooperation begins. My private idea and key message is simply this: deeper understanding is the precondition for meaningful cooperation. Understanding first, and next cooperation will be better. So this is my summary of the two events.
So I said it's housing, not housing. And why urban planning matter? Because, okay, especially I'm just jumping into the housing issues. The housing has many different aspects, and the urban planning and urban power is a great domain. But let me just jump in with a concrete example. So the housing, I think there are key ingredients. I said is a triple A, which means the physical accessibility, economic affordability, and social assistance program. So accessibility, physical accessibility means the people living in the houses need to access the jobs and opportunities and markets. And also the water, clean water, the waste treatment or energy connections, and schools, healthcare system, and community and safety issues. And affordability, it's a two side. One is income generation, the other one is housing cost. But the missing part of the housing cost is usually, oftentimes we miss about the cost of transportation and utility, not just only the houses. So that's all inclusive the housing cost. And third one is some assistance for the inclusiveness and community, especially for the low-income people or deprived the people. They need some kind of the help. Otherwise, even though we provide some housing program, they are easy to displaced by like a higher income or some the power of the other. So we need some regulation system to protect or to include everybody. So let me give you an example. So I visited Maputo 2-3 years ago, and for the housing the program, this is a great in terms of the house, nice, great size and facilities great, but as you can see here, the location first. It's located at the edge of the Maputo. So there is no like a good road and street system or public transportation, which means they have to travel more than 1 hour, one direction to get to the job, even it's very low income. So they need to spend more than 2-3 hours to go there and back the home. And the transportation cost is not that low compared to their income, because their income is one of the lowest income, because the housing is the low income people. And if you look at the right picture, it's in the middle of nowhere, which means where is the school? Where is the hospitals? Where are the services? So there is no services. So in terms of the accessibility and the affordability, I said there's a transportation cost and other cost for the living. The living cost is high. The house cost is relatively low, but the living cost, living over there, requires much money. So we need to think about it. And some assistance program, but not enough to protect the low-income people. So it looks like a great, But in terms of house, yeah, house is great. But in terms of housing, it's not enough, or relatively, or it's rather say like it's a kind of the sprawl because of low density, far away neural services. Although house themselves looks good, so that's the so their housing living condition is getting better or not. That's the question. So let me just bring up one aspect of the urban planning is a spatial structure. But there are many things, infrastructure or economy, social. But one, the basic is a spatial structure. So there are largely 3 or specifically 6, like a density and center system. So we have to have a decent density, so called like 100 people per hectare at least. And the center system, where is the CBD or town center, village center, and system with the connections, street network, and public transportation. So we need to link them to get the accessibility, and they get the jobs, get the opportunity, go to school, services, markets. And the third component is open space, like a public space, like a street, parks, and the playground. And also there is a nature space for ecology. So we need to protect some areas for the nature. It's like a green infrastructure plus ecological aspect. So let me just wrap up quickly. So I said that housing, not house. So AAA's accessibility, affordability, and assistance program. So the house, it's not about the bricks and mortars. We are talking about the people. So we need to plan a neighborhood, not the house. It's not a house construction, each individual, 10 houses. We need a neighborhood with the houses and schools and services, libraries and markets. That's the basic unit of the city. And we need to make a system of such kind of the neighborhood with a higher level. That's the city. We need urban planning first, and then make each neighborhood at a right location, right connections. So I just pointed about the spatial structure aspect of the urban planning is a density and center, connection, and open space. So let me stop here. And I already shared this PDF, so you already have the PDF. So let me stop here and let's move on to the discussions.